Hello, it's John Heaton, and this evening I'm going to talk about a subject which I've thought about over the years, and I'm going to consider whether Wings should have carried on after Back to the Egg, and how would it have turned out if they had done. So the first up, this is just a fun discussion. I'm not trying to change history. I know it's primarily McCartney's band, and he had the perfect right to do whatever he liked with it. Wings without McCartney is a bit like the Beach Boys without Brian Wilson, or even worse, maybe. So, I'm not saying he wasn't the central character, but I think there was a benefit of if Wings had stayed together, which I'll come to. So the first question is, how would they have coped with those solo excursions, which were truly solo excursions, such as Wonderful Christmas Time and McCartney 2? Well, I guess they could have been one-off singles, a one-off album and a one-off single on his own, and then back to Wings. And Paul obviously thought the same at the time, because in the fall of 1980, Wings went back into the studio and rehearsed. And even in February 81 in Montserrat, Denny Laine was on hand with McCartney and Linda, so it wasn't quite the full Wings lineup, but it wasn't solo either completely. So we obviously have Tug of War from 1982, which at the time was acclaimed and still regarded as one of his best albums. But if one were to make a criticism of Tug of War, it didn't quite rock hard enough, and it missed that kind of band feel. Electric guitars are few and far between, rockers are few and far between, and the whole thing was a little bit saccharine. Pretty decent saccharine, great ballads such as Here Today and stuff, but just lacking that certain oomph perhaps, if it had been recorded with the band. The backing vocals are a bit glossy, Eric Stewart I always found. Whereas Denny and Linda, backing vocals with Wings, had they were unique and not glossy, just unique. And if I compare a track, for example, like London Town, the title track, and Paul, Linda and Denny singing together on that superbly, to the, as I say, glossy backing vocals of Take It Away, it's the latter is a bit of a production trick, and the former is a band truly singing well together. That's just my opinion. Was George Martin to blame for Wings splitting up? Quite possibly. According to Steve Holley, I think it was, Paul called him up, and instead of saying, I don't want to continue with Wings, he fobbed it off on George Martin and said, George Martin thinks it's a good idea if I don't work with Wings and I work with other people, and sorry, bye-bye. The same was said to Lawrence Juba. Lawrence Juba did work with Paul on the Ringo album Stop and Smell the Roses, recorded in France in the fall of 1980, but by early 81 Juba and Holly had been let go, and one can speculate why this was. I think the 79 tour was a bit underwhelming for Paul. It paled in comparison to the 76 tour, as well it might have done, because it wasn't so well rehearsed. Before I go on to whether Wings should have carried on, I'll give you three reasons why I think Wings split up. One, the drug bust in Tokyo, when Wings were about to tour Japan in January of 1980. That didn't help at all. That sowed a few seeds of division amongst the band members. Not necessarily irreconcilable differences, but that didn't help. The commercial lack of success, comparatively speaking, of Back to the Egg, I'm sure didn't help. Paul was used to having hits come the late 70s, and when he didn't have a top 10 hit, although Goodnight Tonight was a top 5 hit in the UK, the singles from Back to the Egg were relative flops, and I'm sure Paul thought long and hard about that, about what the reason was. Carr and Tyler in their book keep on suggesting that Paul should go solo when they're reviewing London Town and Back to the Egg. But I wonder if they known what would have happened, whether they would be saying the same thing as they said back then. I know hindsight's a beautiful thing. But anyway, and then the third reason I think Wings split up was John's death, as a result of which Paul didn't want to tour, and he didn't tour for another 9 years. And I'm sure that didn't help. That contributed to Denny leaving and probably put the final nail in Wings' coffin in terms of any future for the band. So those are objectively the reasons, and maybe there was a bit of chemistry lacking with that final lineup of Wings, although it's always been one of my favourite lineups. I know it's difficult to pick a favourite. Obviously the glory years of the mid-70s were represented by Joe English and Jimmy McCulloch, that lineup with Paul Linder and Denny. The early Wings years by Denny Seiwell and Henry McCulloch, they've all got their charm. From a musician's point of view, I guess that 75, 76 is probably the best. But Jimmy McCulloch was an unstable guy to have in a band, and I'm not sure if he could have withstood many tours. So in terms of professionalism and decent musicianship, level-headedness, I think that last Back to the Egg band was brilliant, and I think they could have developed some continuity had they carried. They certainly deserve one more album. I would personally have liked them to have carried on through the 80s. We could have had the odd solo single if Paul wanted to do Ebony and Ivory with Stevie Wonder. He could have done that, but I think a few things we would have avoided if Wings had carried on. This is my opinion. He wouldn't have felt the need to have these endless collaborations, particularly with Michael Jackson, which I thought was an attempt to have hits, which worked, but could have done without that. Carl Perkins on Tug of War, I could have really done without that. Even Elvis Costello, I think, was a good partner to write with, but the one time when they actually sang together on You Want Her Too, I could have done without that song, to be honest. I think it's pretty annoying. I think the albums, I think the songwriting would have continued along the same veins. I mean, a lot of the stuff on Tug of War and Pipes of Peace was demoed with Wings in the fall of 1980. But I think with a band behind Pipes of Peace in particular and Tug of War, we would have had a more rocking album to its benefit. Eric Stewart I always saw as a bit of a poor replacement for Denny Laine. Not that he's not talented and he was in 10cc and all that. It's just I would have preferred Denny to stay. I think he was beginning to contribute great stuff on London Town and Back to the Egg of his own. And he, after all, was the one who brought in Lawrence and Steve. They were friends of his. I think we might have... Press to Play might have been an in-string album had it been a Wings album. I don't think albums in the 80s from Paul benefited from having different musicians on different track or Paul playing all the instruments. The Give My Regards to Broad Street fiasco may or may not have been avoided, but if Wings had been in that film, it might have been a more enjoyable film than having these anonymous, well, not anonymous, but musicians like Chris Spedding and Dave Edmunds coming in and going almost at the same speed. Linda rather unkindly said in 1984 regarding Wings, Paul chose the wrong people. The Wings guys were good but not great. And then she went on to say that Red Rose Speedway, for example, was such a non-confident album, which I found staggering. You know, maybe she was comparing it to the success of the later albums, but Red Rose Speedway has its charm, as we've seen in the re-release, and it's always had its charm for me. And lack of confidence, maybe. Smoking too much pot, maybe. But I think it's a fine little album. So Another Day, Another Dollar, getting a little bit boring, Paul has said in the Wingspan book. What else? As I say, McCartney 2 could have been a one-off solo excursion. I would have liked to seen this. I suppose Wings could have carried on with differing lineups, changing every few years, but I think this lineup could have stayed together and could have done several tours. Could have had the odd guest appearing with them if necessary. But even Flowers on the Dirt, which is a return to form of sorts according to some, that definitely benefited from having a band, and I would have probably preferred Lawrence and Steve to be that band along with Denny and Paul and Linda, as opposed to Hamish Stewart and Robbie McIntosh, although they're great as well. But I just basically am a Wings fan. I wanted to see them continue, and I'm a big fan of them individually as musicians, and the chemistry. The Back to the Egg video special is brilliant watching, and obviously we keenly await the archive release of that album, long awaited. Whether we'll see it shortly or not, I don't know, but I'm hopeful. And that was just a fun bit of conjecture from me, and it's only my opinion. Thank you for watching. See you next time.